What do you do when the mission succeeds but the science fails? That's the question NASA faced on April 10th when Artemis II splashed down alive and well. But the instruments told a completely different narrative. 3 datasets have vanished into bureaucratic limbo. Radiation numbers that shatter every safety model textbooks say should work. Heat shield telemetry from a system so experimental that actual astronauts went on record saying it shouldn't be flying humans. And instrument data from an M7.5 solar event that hammered the crew while they were floating defenseless in the vacuum. The mission looked perfect. The reality is anything but. Tonight, we're diving into the hidden data, the official warnings nobody listened to, and the troubling implications for every crewed mission heading beyond low Earth orbit. By the end of this video, you'll understand why NASA's silence on this speaks louder than any press release ever could. If these mysteries have you hooked the way they have me, make sure to hit like and subscribe to the Skylab so you don't miss a single update as this story unfolds. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from, what time it is there, and whether you believe we're getting the full truth about these world-changing discoveries. And if you want to help this community grow, share this video on X, Facebook, Reddit, or even just in your group chats. You're the reason we can keep chasing stories like this, so thank you for having our back. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The mission they're calling perfect. Last night, the Pacific Ocean swallowed fire. At 007 Universal Time on April 11th, 2026, that's 8:07 in the evening, Eastern Daylight April 10th, the Orion spacecraft slammed into the water roughly 200 miles southwest of San Diego, moving at approximately 25,000 miles per hour, which is Mach 32, the fastest crewed re-entry in human history. The water must have hit the capsule like a concrete wall. The parachutes had already deployed, 3 massive canopies arranged in a pattern that had never before caught a crew returning from the moon. But the impact was still violent enough that you could see the shock ripple through the frame in the recovery footage. Within minutes, the USS John P. Murtha was on station, helicopters spinning overhead, divers in the water. And then something happened that we're all supposed to celebrate. All 4 astronauts, Reed Wiseman commanding, Victor Glover piloting, Christina Kocher's mission specialist, and Jeremy Hansen from the Canadian Space Agency, walked from those recovery helicopters to the medical bay under their own power. They walked. After 10 days in space, after hurtling past the moon, after becoming the first human beings in over 50 years to see our planet as a blue marble from beyond cislunar space, they could still walk. The photos came in quickly. The crew inside Orion, still in their orange launch and entry suits, surrounded by recovery personnel grinning. And then the image that everyone shared, the one that NASA used on every press release and social media post. Earthset from the lunar far side. Thus our homeworld reduced to a thin crescent of blue and gold against the blackness, just disappearing over the moon's ancient scarred horizon. That image was the whole story, or at least it was supposed to be. That image said everything was fine. That image said we had done it. NASA held a press conference on April 7th, while the crew was still on its way home, and the message was unambiguous. Artemis II was a flawless triumph. The Orion performed exactly as designed. The heat shield survived re-entry without issue. The radiation exposure was within acceptable parameters. Everything worked. Everything was perfect. We've heard this before, by the way. If you've been watching this channel, you know this story already. In video 39, we told you that the most dangerous part of the Artemis missions isn't the launch, it's coming home. We showed you the math on why re-entry at Mach 32, from a trajectory that had never been tried with humans aboard, represented a set of variables that the simulation models couldn't completely predict. We did videos on the heat shield design, on the guidance algorithms, on every possible failure scenario. We also covered the radiation environment, the solar activity during the mission window, the particle flux in cislunar space, the magnetospheric conditions, everything. In video 43, we flagged the timing concerns with respect to the solar cycle. In video 45, we broke down the sensor networks aboard Orion. In video 47, 3 days ago, we asked a specific question. What happens if a major solar event fires during this window? Well, the mission is over now. The crew is home, they're healthy, they're walking, and they're talking to the media about how incredible the experience was. And none of that is wrong. They did something extraordinary. The data coming back is extraordinary too. But here's what nobody's talking about. And this is where I need you to pay attention, because this matters more than the headlines. NASA has not released 3 categories of data from this mission. The first is the detailed radiation dosimetry, not the summary numbers, but the granular breakdown by mission phase, by crew member, and by radiation type. The second is the heat shield inspection results from the re-entry. The detailed thermal imaging and material analysis from a re-entry profile that had never been tested with a crewed vehicle at this mass and velocity before. And the third, the one that almost nobody in mainstream media is asking about, is the sensor readout from the HERA and DLR systems during the Me 7.5 solar flare that hammered Earth and everything in cislunar space on April 4th, while the crew was completely unshielded in the outbound portion of their trajectory. These 3 datasets exist. They were collected by some of the most sophisticated instruments humanity has ever built. They were transmitted back to Earth in real time. They are currently in possession of NASA, the German Aerospace Center, and several universities and research institutions, and they have not been released. Now, I want to be clear about something because this is important. The crew is safe. All 4 of them are healthy. The mission succeeded in every measurable way. Nobody is saying that the mission failed or that people are in danger right now, but the sensors aboard that spacecraft recorded something that exceeded what NASA's pre-flight models predicted by approximately 18%, and that discrepancy, that gap between prediction and reality, that is the story we need to understand. Because if the models were off by 18% on a 10-day mission to the Moon, the question becomes, how off will they be on a 900-day mission to Mars? And that's the question that determines whether Artemis II flies on schedule, whether humans can actually survive extended deep space missions, and whether NASA is about to repeat the institutional decision-making patterns that preceded Challenger and Columbia. The crew walked out of the recovery helicopters, and we all cheered. But the sensors recorded something else entirely, and that's where we need to start. Part 2. The 18% problem. The preliminary radiation dosimetry report came out in pieces. NASA released a preliminary summary while the crew was still in flight, and updated it after splashdown at the recovery facility in San Diego. The numbers looked fine. Each of the 4 astronauts accumulated approximately 12 millisieverts of radiation dose over the entire 10-day mission. Kerry Lee, the radiation health officer from NASA's Space Medicine Division, released a statement saying the dose was, quote, well within career safety limits and reflected the unpredictable nature of the current solar maximum. 12 millisieverts. That's roughly equivalent to 6 CT scans of the chest, or about 40 times the annual background radiation exposure that an average person gets in the United States. It's a significant dose, absolutely, but it's not dangerous. It's not even close to the career limit, which sits at 50 millisieverts for NASA astronauts. So by that metric, by the number that matters most in terms of acute health risk, everything looks acceptable. The problem is that the 18% discrepancy isn't actually about absolute safety. It's about model fidelity. And model fidelity is the foundation upon which every single future mission is built. What wasn't released was the granular breakdown. We don't know how much dose each individual crew member accumulated. We don't know which mission phase produced the highest radiation flux. We don't know the composition of the radiation environment, how much came from solar particle events, how much from the galactic cosmic ray background, how much from secondary radiation produced by cosmic rays interacting with the Orion structure itself. We don't know the directional characteristics. We don't have the temporal resolution. All of that information exists in the sensor data, and none of it has been made public. The 18% figure comes from preliminary telemetry only, mind you. The detailed analysis of the radiation environment will take weeks, potentially months, to fully process and understand. The instruments aboard Orion captured enormous amounts of data, far more than we can fully analyze in days, but the early numbers, the ones that filtered up to NASA leadership and then down to the press briefing, suggested that the accumulated dose exceeded the pre-flight models by roughly 18%. Now, 18% might sound like nothing. It's within the error margin of most scientific measurements. It's smaller than weather variations. But in the context of deep space mission planning, 18% is not a rounding error. Let me show you why. The Artemis II mission lasted 10 days. The crew travelled approximately 240,000 miles from Earth to the Moon and back again, spending most of that time in an environment with essentially zero magnetospheric protection. The cumulative radiation dose over those 10 days was roughly 12 millisieverts per person. That's 12 units of dose accumulated over 240 hours of exposure. If the models were 18% low, that means the actual dose rate was 18% higher than predicted. Now scale that out. A Mars mission requires a round trip of approximately 900 days. One way is roughly 450 days through cislunar space and then interplanetary space, with no planetary magnetic field to shield the crew, just the spacecraft's hull and whatever additional shielding they build in. If the dose rate is 18% higher than models predict, then over 450 days, instead of accumulating roughly 54 millisieverts, which is just barely under the career safety limit, the crew would accumulate roughly 64 millisieverts. That's 10 millisieverts over the limit, and that's just the one-way transit. That's before they arrive, descend to the surface, explore for 3 weeks, ascend back to orbit, and then spend 450 more days on the return journey. The math compounds, the uncertainty multiplies, and when you're planning a mission where the crew is exposed to 300 to 400 millisieverts of total dose over 900 days, when the career safety limit is 50 millisieverts, when the gap between the model prediction and the actual measurements is 18%, you're not talking about a minor discrepancy anymore. You're talking about the difference between a mission that's conceivably possible and a mission that pushes the boundaries of what human physiology can tolerate. And if the models are off by more than 18%, if the actual discrepancy is 20 or 25 or 30%, then we're not planning to send astronauts to Mars anymore. We're planning to send them to Mars and probably give them cancer, probably shorten their lifespans, probably expose them to radiation sickness symptoms that we haven't even seen before, because nobody has been exposed to radiation doses at that level during spaceflight. This is why the 18% matters. This is why the detailed breakdown matters. This is why we need to see the granular dosimetry data broken down by mission phase, by crew member, by radiation type. Because right now, all we have is a summary number. All we have is Kerry Lee saying it's within acceptable limits, and within acceptable limits in 2026 doesn't necessarily mean it's acceptable for 2027, when Artemis III is scheduled to actually land on the Moon. It doesn't mean it's acceptable for 2031, when the first crewed landing on Mars is theoretically supposed to happen. The models were off by 18% on a 10-day mission. We need to understand why before we send people on a 450-day mission, and we need to understand it before the decision gets made to push Artemis III forward despite whatever the detailed analysis reveals. Part 3. The Sensor Network. Nobody is talking about. The Orion spacecraft that came home last night carried the most sophisticated radiation monitoring suite ever mounted on a crewed vehicle. There were 10 instruments or instrument packages aboard, distributed throughout the capsule and mounted in various configurations to provide overlapping redundant measurements of the radiation environment. There were 2 primary independent systems plus personal dosimeters worn by each crew member. The first major system was the HERA package. That's the Human Research Program Exploration Research and Technology Operations, though that acronym is mostly just administrative. The HERA system consisted of 6 sensor units installed throughout the Orion capsule, and these weren't off-the-shelf radiation detectors. They were Timepix-based sensors derived from technology originally developed at CERN, manufactured by Advocam, a company based in the Czech Republic. Timepix sensors can do something that most radiation detectors can't. They can simultaneously measure the radiation dose rate, the particle composition, distinguishing between protons and heavier ions, the energy spectra of incoming radiation, and the directional characteristics. They can tell you not just how much radiation is hitting the spacecraft, but what kind of radiation, from what direction, at what energies. The HERA system was collecting continuous telemetry throughout the entire mission, and there's an integrated alarm function that's designed to trigger shelter construction procedures if the radiation environment suddenly spikes above preset thresholds. So if a solar event occurred, if a major radiation burst happened while the crew was in an unshielded phase of flight, the system would immediately notify the crew and recommend protective action. The second major system was even more advanced. It was the DLRM-42EXT package developed by the German Aerospace Center, the Deutsches Zentrum für Luft- und Raumfahrt. DLR had flown sensors on Artemis I, but the M42EXT was an upgraded design with 6 times the measurement resolution of the original Artemis I configuration. It could distinguish between different particle types, including heavy ions that most detectors can't even detect. The upgraded system included 8 dosimeters total, 4 that actually flew on Artemis II, and 4 backups that are currently in storage at Kennedy Space Center. According to the flight manifest, the DLR dosimeters were delivered to Kennedy Space Center on February 2, 2026, just 2 weeks before launch, suggesting they had just completed final calibration and integration. In addition to those 2 major systems, each crew member was wearing a personal active dosimeter, specifically Mirion Technologies' passive and active badges that measure dose accumulation in real time and transmit data back to the vehicle systems. So when you add all of that together, when you combine the HERA 6 sensor array with the DLR M42EXT package and the 4 personal dosimeters, you have a sensor network of 11 different measurement points, all collecting overlapping data, all measuring slightly different aspects of the radiation environment, all operating simultaneously throughout the mission. This is the most detailed radiation monitoring dataset ever collected during a crewed mission beyond low Earth orbit. Everything that happened in the radiation environment around that spacecraft between April 1st and April 10th was captured in extraordinary detail. Now, why does that matter? Because on April 4th, 2026, at 0107 Universal Time, the Sun produced an M7.5 class solar flare. It originated from a sunspot region that was located at N02W02 on the solar disk. That means it was roughly centered on the face of the Sun as seen from Earth, pointed almost directly at us, and pointed almost directly at the Artemis II crew, which at that moment was roughly 100,000 miles from Earth, completely beyond the magnetosphere, with 0 planetary protection, exposed to the raw solar particle radiation that the flare ejected into interplanetary space. An M7.5 flare is the second strongest classification below X-class. It's about 2.5 times weaker than the minimum threshold for an X-class flare, but it's still an enormous release of energy, roughly equivalent to millions of megatons of TNT detonating simultaneously on the Sun. Within 22 hours of that initial M7.5 event, 3 additional M-class flares erupted from the same sunspot region. An M1.7 at 0738 UTC, an M1.2 at 1158 UTC, an M1.0 at 2254 UTC. 4 M-class flares in one day from a near-disk center source during the solar maximum, during the only crewed deep space mission that's currently in flight, represents an astronomically improbable conjunction of circumstances. The crew was positioned to be struck by the radiation from every one of those events, and the sensors aboard Orion recorded every photon, every proton, every particle of radiation that those flares ejected towards cislunar space. That dataset, the complete radiation profile across all 11 measurement points during a major solar storm event, with the crew unshielded in deep space, is scientifically priceless. It's also probably the scariest data that NASA has in its possession right now, and it has not been released. Datasets. Part 4. The Day Everything Changed, April 4th. You need to understand what was happening aboard the Orion spacecraft on April 4th, the 3rd day of the mission. The crew was in the middle of the outbound transit phase, roughly halfway to the Moon, travelling through cislunar space at approximately 7,000 miles per hour relative to Earth. They were sleeping on a schedule that had them awake for roughly 16 hours and asleep for 8 hours each day. Not the full sleep cycle they would get on Earth, but they were trying to maintain something approaching a normal circadian rhythm. The capsule was in a stable configuration, running on internal power, with the solar arrays generating electricity in the sunlight and the radiators dissipating heat into the vacuum. Though everything was nominal, everything was proceeding exactly as planned, and then, at 0107 UTC, the Sun exploded. The M7.5 flare, when it occurred, was a near-disk center event, meaning it was pointed almost directly at Earth and almost directly at the Artemis II spacecraft. The photons from that flare reached both locations simultaneously, travelling at the speed of light. The visible light signature showed up in NASA's satellite network immediately. The NORAD warning systems lit up. Space weather forecasters at NOAA started updating their alerts, but the radiation was harder to predict. An M7.5 flare typically produces a brief, intense pulse of X-rays and gamma rays, followed by energetic particle radiation that travels more slowly through space, taking minutes to hours to reach Earth depending on the energy distribution. the Artemis II crew, located roughly 100,000 miles from Earth, would have experienced the radiation pulse roughly 15 to 30 minutes after the X-ray burst. The Orion capsule has shielding. It's not much, roughly 5 to 10 millimeters of aluminum hull material that provides marginal protection against high-energy cosmic rays and solar particles, but it's something. The crew could have sheltered inside the propellant tanks if the situation had called for it, since dense liquid propellant provides much better radiation shielding than the capsule walls. But the procedures for emergency shelter inside a capsule during an operational phase of flight are limited. There's nowhere to really go. You're inside a small cabin with 3 other people, moving through space at thousands of miles per hour, and suddenly there's a radiation pulse hitting your spacecraft, and all you can do is shelter in place and hope the shielding is enough. If you were paying any attention to our video 41 posted 3 days ago, you know that we flagged the M7.5 event in real time. We had the space weather data, we knew the flare had occurred, we knew the crew was in a vulnerable phase of flight, we knew the exposure was real, and we watched the news cycle ignore it completely. The space agencies didn't ignore it. The radiation monitoring systems didn't ignore it. The sensor networks aboard Orion certainly didn't ignore it. Every one of the 11 measurement points detected the spike. The HERA system recorded it. The DLRM-42EXT package recorded it. The personal dosimeters recorded it. Each sensor has a different response function, different energy thresholds, different directional sensitivity, but collectively they captured the complete radiation profile. They know exactly how much radiation hit the crew, from what direction, at what energy distribution. They know what the particle composition was. They know if it was primarily protons, or if there were heavier ions. They can probably reconstruct the spectra of the solar particle event with better precision than we can measure it from Earth, simply because the crew was there, in situ, experiencing it directly. But the M7.5 wasn't the only event. Within 22 hours, the same active region produced 3 more M-class flares. The M1.7 at 0738 UTC on April 4th was followed by the M1.2 at 1158 UTC, and then the M1.0 at 2254 UTC the same day. 3 additional solar storms, all from the same sunspot region, all within roughly 24 hours of each other, and all roughly pointed at the Artemis II spacecraft. The probability of that happening by random chance is extraordinarily low. During the solar maximum, active regions do produce multiple flares, but the statistical probability of 4 M-class events from a single near-disk center source within 1 day, timed to coincide with the only crewed deep space mission currently in flight, requires the conjunction of multiple independent improbable events. It would be like dropping a coin 4 separate times and getting heads every time. It's possible, but if it happens consistently, you start asking whether the coin is fair, you start asking whether something else is going on. There was one additional M-class event on April 9th, an M1.0, but it originated from a different solar region on the far side of the disk, so the particle radiation from that event reached Earth differently than it reached Artemis II. That event was less significant in terms of crew exposure, but still worth noting because it demonstrates that the solar activity pattern throughout the Artemis II mission was unusually vigorous. The Sun was particularly active during the 10-day window when humans were transiting to the Moon and back, and on April 4th specifically, during the 3rd day of the mission, during the outbound phase when the crew was most vulnerable, the Sun aimed 4 M-class flares directly at them in the space of roughly 24 hours. The HERA system captured that, the DLR system captured that, the personal dosimeters captured that. All 11 measurement points recorded the complete radiation environment during a major solar storm event with unshielded crew in deep space, and then, 4 days later, something happened that nobody has explained. Part 5, Flight Day 8, the shelter question. 4 days after that, 7.5 flare on April 8th, the crew of Artemis II did something that nobody has talked about publicly, and that silence is exactly what you need to pay attention to. They conducted what NASA calls a radiation shelter construction demonstration, essentially a drill to build a makeshift bunker inside the Orion capsule that would protect them if a solar storm showed up and they couldn't get home. The capsule wasn't designed for long-term deep space missions in the first place, so every lander that's ever gone beyond Earth's magnetic field has carried contingency protocols for radiation emergencies, but this was the first time the Artemis program had tested one in actual flight, during actual solar activity, and 5 days into a sustained radiation storm. The protocol itself was straightforward enough on paper. Reconfigure the cabin, move additional structural mass between the crew and the least shielded walls, create a geometry that would give them a fighting chance if a coronal mass ejection or a hard proton event came screaming toward them with no warning. The demonstration was designed to be completable in roughly 1 hour and sustainable for up to 24 hours if the worst-case scenario actually materialized. But here's what makes this timing so suspicious, and here's where the unreleased data becomes crucial to understanding what really happened on that mission. The shelter demonstration was originally planned to include the full stowage relocation procedure, the moving of lockers and equipment and supplies throughout the cabin to optimize the shielding geometry. That was the full version of the test. What was actually conducted on April 8th was a shortened version. They tested ventilation for astronaut sheltering specifically inside a locker compartment, but they omitted the major stowage moving elements that would have created the truly robust emergency shelter. Why? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is timing. The demonstration happened 4 days after the M7.5 flare, during a period when the electron flux remained elevated and dangerous. The electron sensors aboard Orion were running the whole time. The HERA units were actively monitoring, their alarm function activated throughout the mission. So the sensors have a record of exactly what radiation environment the crew was working in during that shelter demonstration. The sensors have a record of whether the cabin walls they were moving around actually provided meaningful protection. The sensors have a record of whether that abbreviated test was really adequate preparation for what they might face on Artemis II. You need to ask yourself whether this demonstration was pre-planned as part of the original mission schedule, or whether it was ordered up in a hurry after the April 4th flare, a reactive safety review conducted while the mission was still happening. I don't have that answer yet. NASA hasn't released the mission timeline clarifications or the procedural authority logs that would explain why the test was shortened or what the triggering decision was. But the HERA data from April 8th would tell us. The dosimeters recorded the radiation environment while the crew was working, while they were moving around the cabin, while they were inside that locker compartment testing whether it would protect them. That data would tell us whether the shelter geometry they tested is actually adequate for Artemis III. That data would tell us what safety margins exist if a real emergency happens during a lunar mission, when the astronauts can't come home in 8 days. The fact that data hasn't been released is the second unreleased dataset that's sitting somewhere in a secured server at NASA, waiting to be examined and explained. The shelter question is existential because if the shelter doesn't work, if the testing showed inadequate protection, then the entire crewed lunar program grinds to a halt. You don't send humans to the moon if you can't guarantee them a survival protocol when the sun goes berserk. So when NASA stays silent about what the sensors recorded during that demonstration, the implications are profound. When the HERA alarm system triggers, it does not announce itself gently. The sensors detect a threshold exceedance, and the spacecraft systems immediately begin a cascade of responses that were choreographed months before launch during countless simulations at Mission Control in Houston. The crew in the Orion capsule would see visual indicators light up on their displays, and at nearly the same moment, flight controllers monitoring real-time telemetry thousands of miles below would catch the same alert on their screens. This is where the architecture of deep space exploration reveals its vulnerability. The crew cannot simply step outside to inspect the problem. They cannot radio down to Houston for an immediate decision, because the communication delay between Earth and the spacecraft on its trajectory means that by the time Mission Control receives their message and formulates a response, several minutes have already elapsed. For a radiation event unfolding at the speed of light, those minutes constitute an eternity. The protocol for a triggered HERA alarm requires the crew to execute a specific sequence of actions designed during mission planning. First, they must verify that the alarm is genuine and not a sensor malfunction, which requires them to cross-reference multiple independent measurements and assess the current state of their radiation shielding. Second, they must implement passive countermeasures, which for Artemis II meant repositioning themselves within the capsule to shelter behind denser materials or moving towards specific shielded areas that were pre-identified as radiation refuges. Third, they must assess whether any active mitigation is possible, such as adjusting the spacecraft's orientation to present less vulnerable surfaces to incoming radiation streams. Throughout this entire process, The crew is managing elevated stress levels while maintaining focus on procedures that have been rehearsed but never actually experienced in the real environment of cislunar space. The psychological burden of knowing that a radiation event is actively occurring while you're attempting to execute a choreographed response is a dimension of spaceflight that simulators can approximate but never truly replicate. And this is exactly the kind of human factors data that remains missing from the public record. The decision-making tree at mission control becomes more complex when an alarm is triggered during a crewed mission. Flight controllers must weigh several competing concerns simultaneously. They must determine whether the detected radiation event represents an ongoing threat or a transient phenomenon that has already passed. They must evaluate whether the crew's current position and shielding posture is adequate, or whether they should transition to emergency protocols. They must consider the remaining duration of the mission, and whether it is safer to continue forward toward lunar orbit, or to implement an emergency return trajectory that would bring the crew home sooner, but might also place them in riskier orbital positions. Each of these decisions has cascading implications for mission success and crew safety, and each decision must be made with incomplete information, because real-time radiation data is being transmitted at light speed. But the interpretation of that data requires expert analysis that takes additional time. The unreleased HERA dataset contains the specific threshold values that were established for various alarm categories, the sensor performance during the actual flight, and the precise moments when mission control made its decisions in response to detected events. This information has never been released to independent researchers, who might analyze whether the decision-making thresholds were appropriate or whether they need revision for future missions. Now consider what occurs when we project this scenario forward to Artemis II, where the crew will not be orbiting safely above the lunar surface, but will instead be walking on it, exploring the South Polar region, where ice deposits may hold the keys to long-term human habitation. An astronaut on the lunar surface is not merely further away from Earth in terms of distance, they are fundamentally removed from the spacecraft's radiation shielding, exposed to whatever the lunar environment offers by way of protection, which in most locations is essentially nothing more than the suit and the terrain itself. If a significant radiation event were to trigger aboard the Orion spacecraft in lunar orbit, while the crew is deployed on the surface, the response protocol becomes infinitely more complicated. The crew on the surface cannot instantly return to the spacecraft. They cannot sprint across the lunar regolith in any shorter time than their pre-planned ascent requires. They would be aware, through their suit communications, that an alarm had been triggered above them, and they would have to make decisions about whether to accelerate their timeline, cut their mission short, or trust that the threat on the orbital vehicle poses no additional danger to them on the ground. This scenario has been modelled in mission planning, but the specific data that would allow mission control to make those decisions with high confidence is housed in the unreleased dataset. The actual performance of the HERA sensors, the reliability of the alarm thresholds under real-world conditions, and the margin of safety that existed during Artemis II have never been disclosed, and without that information, the protocols for Artemis III rest on assumptions that may prove inadequate when they are tested against actual crewed operations on another world. Part 6. The Broader Radiation Storm. To understand why that shelter test was even necessary in the first place, you need to grasp the larger picture of what the radiation environment actually was during the entire Artemis II mission, and it's worse than the headlines suggested. The mission didn't just encounter one solar flare and then coast through calm conditions. It flew through what you might call an extended radiation event that lasted nearly the entire second week in April, a period of sustained elevated particle flux that kept the crew in a hostile environment far longer than a single flare would have. The electron flux, which measures high-energy particles spiraling in from the sun and trapped in the radiation belts, exceeded 1,000 particle flux units, continuously starting on April 3rd. That means 8 consecutive days of dangerous radiation levels. Yesterday, the fourth maximum was 1,714 PFU. On April 9th alone, it climbed to 10,680 PFU. Those numbers aren't abstractions. They represent billions of particles hitting the spacecraft, penetrating the hull, delivering dose to tissue in real time, and the crew had exactly 0 planetary shielding because they were outside Earth's magnetosphere where it actually matters. The cause of this extended radiation storm was what space weather forecasters call a coronal hole, high-speed solar wind stream. essentially a persistent leak in the sun's corona that keeps ejecting charged particles at elevated velocities over days or even weeks. These streams don't create the explosive drama of a coronal mass ejection, but they're more insidious in some ways because they're steady, relentless, and they can maintain an enhanced radiation belt environment that catches spacecraft off guard because it doesn't announce itself with a dramatic flare. The solar wind speed was running around 582 km per second by the time this briefing was prepared, and the interplanetary magnetic field, the BZ component, dipped to -9 nanotesla, which is enough to trigger what forecasters call geomagnetic storming. On April 10th, the day of splashdown, there was officially a G1 minor geomagnetic storm active at Earth. The forecast for April 11th, that's today by the way, calls for more of the same, CAPE indices hovering around 4.67, which puts us on the edge of that minor storm threshold. The Artemis II crew experienced 5 M-class solar flares plus 1 additional C-class flare between April 4th and 9th, all while they were residing in the radiation belts beyond the magnetosphere's protective bubble, with nothing but the Orion spacecraft's aluminum hull and whatever emergency shelter they could construct between them and the particle stream. This is where the secondary story connects back to what NASA won't release, because the sustained radiation belt enhancement is what makes that 18% exceedance in the radiation models genuinely dangerous. When you exceed a predictive model by 18% during one solar storm, it might be a measurement error or a minor underestimate of the spacecraft shielding. But when you exceed it during a period when the radiation environment itself is elevated beyond historical norms, when the background radiation floor is higher than the models assumed, when you're flying through an extended geomagnetic storm sequence rather than a single isolated event, then that 18% gap becomes a warning signal. The dosimetry data shows the crew received 12 millisieverts of radiation dose, which is real biological exposure, and that's on top of a background environment that was hotter than the pre-flight models predicted. The HERA sensors and the DLRM42EXT units and the Mirion dosimeters all recorded this environment in real time with their full sensor networks active. The data exists. The data was logged. The data was transmitted back to Earth every few hours during the mission. But the data hasn't been analysed publicly or released in any form that would allow independent verification of whether that 18% exceedance is acceptable, manageable, or a harbinger of problems for future missions. Part 7. The splashdown nobody saw. The Artemis. 2 capsule came home on the evening of April 10th, which meant the world didn't see it the way the Apollo flights came down in broad daylight, with cameras catching every dramatic second of the re-entry sequence. This splashdown happened after dark, approaching the recovery zone at roughly 25,000 miles per hour, the hull experiencing temperatures around 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit during those 5 minutes when the plasma sheath was so thick that radio communication went completely dark and you couldn't hear anything except static. The recovery was executed flawlessly from a technical standpoint. USS John P. Merther, an amphibious transport dock, was positioned with 2 MH-60S helicopters from HSC-23, the Wildcards, and Navy divers from EOD-GRU-1 ready to secure the capsule the moment it splashed down. The parachute sequence worked precisely as designed. 2 drogue parachutes deployed at 25,000 feet to slow the spacecraft's initial descent, followed by 3 main parachutes that decelerated the capsule from 325 miles per hour to 17 miles per hour in the span of 1 minute, an enormously violent piece of physics that was happening in darkness, with cameras struggling to track the final approach and the recovery team working their procedures by the glow of spotlights and infrared imaging. The moment that capsule was secured in the well deck of the USS John P. Merther, the heat shield inspection began. There were 2 heat shield experts aboard that recovery ship, specialists who understand the ablative material, the tile patterns, the acceptable damage thresholds, and they started photographing and documenting the thermal protection system before the capsule was even fully secured. Navy divers went into the water with high-resolution cameras capturing images of the heat shield while it was still wet from the Pacific, still hot from re-entry, the ablative material exposed to the exact conditions it was designed to handle. Those photographs exist. Those inspection reports exist. The capsule eventually made its way to Kennedy Space Center for detailed scanning, for thermography, for forensic analysis of every square inch of the thermal protection system, to to understand how it performed during that re-entry profile. Now here's what makes this part of the story so conspicuous by its absence. As of this morning, April 11th, less than 18 hours after splashdown, not a single image of the post-re-entry heat shield has been released to the public. No photographs from the Navy divers. No inspection reports from the thermal protection system experts. No statements about whether the heat shield performed nominally or whether there were any anomalies, damage patterns, material degradation, or areas of concern that might require investigation. This silence is particularly telling because of what happened before the mission launched. Charles Kamada, a former shuttle astronaut, former director of engineering at Johnson Space Center, and one of the foremost thermal structures experts in the country, publicly dissented against the decision to fly Artemis II with the same heat shield that had shown 104 damage sites on Artemis I. The team's formal dissent was acknowledged and then apparently overridden by NASA's leadership. The decision was made to proceed with the mission. And the question of whether that decision was correct has now been answered by the re-entry itself. The heat shield either worked or it didn't. The material either ablated within expected parameters or it didn't. The tile patterns either protected the underlying structure or they didn't. All of that is documented in the imagery and the inspection data, and NASA is choosing not to release it. You might tell yourself that's just bureaucratic caution, that they're still analysing the data, that there's nothing concerning here, and they'll eventually release something when the review process is complete. But the crew splashed down last night. The initial visual inspection would have been completed within hours. The photographs would have been reviewed by the thermal protection system team before sunrise. By this morning, someone at NASA knows whether there's a problem with that heat shield and they're not saying anything. The last time the Artemis heat shield flew, it was on a test flight. That's coming up next, and it matters more than you might think. Part 8. The Speed Record. When Artemis II came screaming back through the upper atmosphere at approximately 24,800 miles per hour, it set a new record, the fastest re-entry speed ever achieved by a crewed spacecraft. That's about 200 miles per hour faster than Apollo 10 achieved in May 1969, the previous record holder, and when you're talking about atmospheric entry dynamics, an extra 200 miles per hour means exponentially more heat, more structural stress, and more aggressive ablation of the thermal protection system. Apollo 10 had the good fortune of flying during a period of solar minimum, when space weather was quiescent and the sun was behaving itself, and nobody had to worry about whether the crew had absorbed dangerous radiation doses during their deep space trajectory. In fact, the historical record shows that the Apollo program was acutely aware of solar radiation risk, and they timed the lunar missions to cluster around solar minimum periods to reduce that exposure. Remarkably, an August 1972 Proton event, which occurred between Apollo 16 and Apollo 17, would have delivered approximately 2600 rem of radiation to an unshielded astronaut in deep space. That's potentially lethal. That's a dose that would likely have killed anyone exposed to it. The Apollo program dodged that bullet through careful scheduling and genuine luck. Artemis II didn't have that luxury because the mission was scheduled before the solar activity forecast could predict the exact conditions it would encounter. The spacecraft launched into what turned out to be an active solar period, accumulated real exposure during actual geomagnetic storms, and generated what is genuinely the first comprehensive dataset on solar radiation exposure during a crewed deep space mission flown in the modern era. Every measurement that the HERA units recorded, every dosimeter reading from the Miriam network, and every sensor output from the DLRM-42 EXT instruments. All of that is unprecedented data about what humans experience when they venture beyond Earth's protective magnetosphere during an active solar phase. This is information that fundamentally shapes whether the Artemis III mission, which is scheduled to land on the Moon in approximately 2 years, can actually proceed as planned, or whether the program needs to face hard questions about crew safety and radiation risk that it hasn't fully resolved yet. The heat shield performed at speeds no crewed spacecraft has ever reached, during a radiation environment that exceeded the pre-flight models, while using a thermal protection system that was controversial enough to warrant a formal dissent before launch. NASA knows the results. The data is sitting in databases and in analysis reports and in the photographs taken by Navy divers in the Pacific darkness. The question is why that data hasn't been shared with the public, with Congress, or with the international spaceflight community, and the institutional pattern here is the piece that should genuinely concern you. because it echoes decisions that were made before Challenger and before Columbia. Inside the aluminum hull of the Orion spacecraft, something is happening that the simple models do not adequately account for, and this something represents perhaps the most insidious radiation threat that the crew faced during Artemis II. When a high-energy cosmic ray particle strikes the aluminum that forms the capsule's pressure wall, it does not simply pass through like a bullet through clear glass. The cosmic ray does not traverse the metal as an inert projectile. Instead, it collides with the nucleus of an aluminum atom at the atomic level, and in that collision, something remarkable and dangerous occurs. The energy of impact is so immense that it shatters the aluminum nucleus, splitting it into fragments, and those fragments are secondary particles that include neutrons, gamma rays, and lighter ions such as protons and alpha particles. These secondary particles are produced inside the spacecraft structure itself, which means they originate from within the very material that was supposed to provide shielding. They are born in the walls that surround the crew. The process is called spallation, and it is the reason why a spacecraft hull can actually generate radiation hazards rather than simply blocking them. The mechanics of spallation reveal a profound problem with conventional radiation shielding assumptions. Engineers designing spacecraft hulls typically calculate the protection that a given thickness of material will provide by modelling the direct passage of primary cosmic ray particles through that material and estimating how many will be stopped or reduced in energy. The calculations assume that the material is fundamentally absorbing the radiation threat, but spallation introduces a secondary radiation field that is generated within the shielding itself. If the primary cosmic ray flux is significant and the hull is thick enough, the secondary radiation produced by spallation can potentially exceed the radiation dose from primary particles alone. This is not a new discovery in radiation physics. It has been understood in the laboratory for decades, but modelling how much secondary radiation is produced inside a spacecraft requires precise knowledge of the incoming cosmic ray spectrum, the composition of the shielding material, and the energy thresholds at which secondary particles are generated. These are exactly the parameters that the DLRM-42EXT sensor package was designed to measure during Artemis II. The six-fold increase in resolution compared to previous instruments meant that the sensor could detect secondary particles with greater precision and count their contribution to the total radiation dose with higher accuracy than any previous crewed mission. What the DLRM-42EXT measured during Artemis II regarding secondary radiation production inside the Orion hull has not been released. And this is the hidden variable that could explain the 18% exceedance that we observed. To understand why secondary radiation production matters so profoundly, imagine a simplified scenario where cosmic rays arriving at the spacecraft have an average energy of 1 gigaelectronvolt. A substantial fraction of those particles will be stopped by the aluminum hull or significantly weakened in energy. But those same collisions produce secondary neutrons and lighter ions that may have energies ranging from 100 megaelectronvolts to several gigaelectronvolts, and these secondary particles travel through the interior of the spacecraft with different interaction properties than the primary particles. A neutron produced in the hull through spallation is far more likely to penetrate to the crew quarters than a primary cosmic ray would be, because neutrons interact differently with matter than charged particles do. A secondary gamma ray produced in the hull can deliver its energy directly to crew tissues without the same kind of gradual energy loss that a primary particle would experience. If the secondary radiation field produced inside the spacecraft walls was significantly higher than the pre-flight models predicted, then the total radiation dose to the crew would be higher than expected, even if the primary cosmic ray flux was consistent with historical observations. The 18% exceedance might not indicate a problem with the cosmic ray environment at all. It might indicate that our understanding of secondary radiation production inside spacecraft structures is incomplete, and that secondary spallation processes are a more dominant radiation source than the pre-flight shielding calculations assumed. The implications for Artemis III and beyond are immediately obvious to anyone who understands the physics. If secondary radiation production was higher during Artemis II than the models predicted, then the shielding design of Orion for Artemis III may be inadequate. The current design incorporates aluminum hull, polyethylene shielding, water supplies, and other materials positioned to absorb and scatter incoming radiation. Every component of that design was optimized based on shielding models that were validated using data from previous uncrewed missions and from the ISS. where the radiation environment is substantially different from cislunar space. When Artemis II flew through that cislunar environment with a sensor package many times more sensitive than previous instruments, it measured the secondary radiation environment with precision that no previous crewed mission had achieved. The data from those measurements would reveal whether secondary radiation production matches the pre-flight models or whether significant discrepancies exist. If discrepancies exist, they would require engineers to redesign the shielding approach for Artemis III, possibly adding more hydrogen-rich materials that are particularly effective at stopping secondary neutrons, or repositioning shielding materials to better isolate crew areas from secondary particle production sites. These are not minor adjustments. These are fundamental changes to the spacecraft's architecture that affect mass, volume, thermal management, and mission design. The complete dataset from the DLR-M42EXT during Artemis II would allow independent researchers to verify whether such changes are necessary. The fact that this dataset has not been released means that Artemis III is being designed based on incomplete information about secondary radiation processes. Part 9. What went wrong on Artemis I? When NASA launched the uncrewed Artemis I capsule in November of 2022, they were essentially sending a ghost ride to the Moon and back, testing every system that would carry humans on Artemis II. The mission succeeded by almost every measure. The Orion spacecraft flew beautifully, the heat shield survived, and the capsule splashed down in the Pacific with its crew compartment intact. But here's what happened next. When engineers began the detailed post-mission inspection, they found something that should have been their first warning that things were not as they assumed. Scattered across 104 distinct locations on the charred Avcoat ablative material, chunks had separated and shed away in patterns that did not match a single prediction from their ground testing laboratories. This wasn't a small anomaly or a measurement error. This was a systemic mismatch between how material was supposed to behave and how it actually behaved when exposed to the actual environment of a lunar return re-entry. For nearly 2 years, engineers tried to understand why. The Avcoat material had been used on Orion from the beginning, inherited partly from decades of shuttle experience and partly from newly formulated batches mixed specifically for the Artemis program. Ground tests had shown it could handle the heating, the pressure, and the ablation rates expected during re-entry. Yet, during skip re-entry, the trajectory Artemis I flew, which dips into the upper atmosphere twice, pulling energy from the planet's gravity well before making a final shallow glide to splashdown, something completely unexpected happened. Between those atmospheric dips, there were periods where the heating stopped momentarily, where the shield experienced a thermal lull. During that lull, thermal energy that had been conducted into the material's interior began to generate gases through normal ablation chemistry. But here is the critical problem that emerged. The Avcoat wasn't porous enough to vent those gases back out to space. Pressure accumulated inside the material, building silently in the microscopic void spaces until the internal stress exceeded the material's tensile strength and it cracked. Those cracks then allowed material to shed in chunks, creating those 104 damage sites that made engineers sit upright in their chairs. What made this discovery even more troubling was what they found when they analysed which regions of the shield had experienced the worst damage. The areas that had been more permeable before flight, that could exchange gases more freely with the surrounding atmosphere during re-entry, had not experienced significant char loss. The gas had vented normally, pressure had never built up, and the material had remained intact. This suggested the root cause wasn't a flaw in the concept of Avcoat, or even necessarily a flaw in the material itself, but rather a failure of the material's consistency across the entire shield. Batch variations, differences in porosity from one manufacturing location to another, inconsistencies in how the material was applied to the capsule, all of these could explain why the same re-entry trajectory produced wildly different results in different spots. But it also meant something deeper. NASA was flying a material that did not have uniform properties, and they were asking it to survive a re-entry profile that pushed it to the edge of its performance envelope. Add those two things together, and you got 104 points of failure that nobody had predicted. The real kicker came in December of 2024, when the full root cause analysis was finally declassified and released. The problem was not the material alone. The problem was not the trajectory alone. The problem was the interaction between the two. A skip re-entry, with its thermal cycling between heated and cooler phases, had created exactly the worst possible conditions for material that was already inconsistent in its porosity. You can redesign the material to be more consistently porous, or you can redesign the trajectory to avoid the thermal cycling problem. But NASA made an interesting choice. They did neither. They kept the same AV-coat with the same material inconsistencies and changed only one variable. They switched Artemis II to a direct re-entry profile, no skip. One continuous plunge from lunar velocity into the lower atmosphere, maintaining high heating rates throughout, allowing AV-coat to char and ablate in the stable, predictable way that ground testing had actually validated. Problem solved, right? Not quite. Because here is what nobody seems to be asking out loud. If switching the re-entry profile fixed the problem, why is NASA not talking about the Artemis II heat shield data? Think about what you would expect to happen after flying that new trajectory on a crewed mission. NASA would want to celebrate it. They would show you high-resolution images of the shield from multiple angles, pointing out how perfectly it performed, how the char pattern matches the models, how every engineer's prediction came true. They would use it to build confidence in the mission and to set up Artemis III. Instead, what you have is silence. The same material flew again. A different trajectory was used. A crewed mission reached lunar velocity and came back through re-entry with that shield, and when that capsule splashed down on April 10, 2026, it should have been the moment when NASA proved that the Artemis I problem was solved. So what are the heat shield inspection results doing sitting in a classified briefing room somewhere instead of in your hands? Part 10. The fix that wasn't a fix. To understand why NASA's solution to the Artemis I heat shield problem is so revealing, you need to understand what they were dealing with structurally. When you send a spacecraft from the Moon back to Earth at approximately 25,000 miles per hour, it tells you you're dealing with kinetic energy equivalent to multiple nuclear warheads. There is no way to slow that down gracefully without dissipating that energy as heat, and the only heat shield that can survive it is one that is designed to be consumed by the re-entry process. AV-coat is an ablative material, which means it is meant to shed away, to sacrifice itself, to convert its own material loss into a cooling mechanism that protects the crew compartment below. Every ounce of AV-coat that chars away and falls off into the atmosphere is an ounce of thermal energy that is no longer trying to cook the astronauts alive. This is not a backup plan. This is the entire plan. The skip re-entry that Artemis I flew was elegant in its engineering. It bounced the spacecraft off the upper atmosphere, used Earth's gravity to reverse the trajectory slightly, bled off some velocity, and then made a second, shallower pass through the atmosphere to final splashdown. This approach had been used on Apollo missions decades earlier, and it worked beautifully for those low Earth orbit crewed capsules. But those capsules were not coming from the Moon. They were coming from the second stage parking orbit, moving at roughly 25,000 miles per hour relative to Earth. Yes, but not stressed by the extra energy that comes from having travelled 250,000 miles away from the planet. The skip re-entry profile for Artemis I was a carefully calculated attempt to use the same approach for lunar return velocity. The problem, as the post-flight analysis revealed, was that thermal cycling between the heated atmospheric pass and the cooler interplanetary coast phase had created conditions that AV-coat simply was not formulated to handle. The material had to undergo rapid heating, rapid cooling, heating again, and cooling again, in a way that ground tests had never really simulated because skip re-entry trajectories are expensive and complex to test. So NASA engineers, sitting in front of data showing 104 heat shield damage sites, had to make a call. They chose to eliminate the skip entirely. Direct re-entry meant one continuous descent from the perigee point where Artemis II entered Earth's atmosphere all the way to splashdown, maintaining high heating rates throughout the event, never allowing temperatures to drop enough for thermal cycling to occur, just never creating the internal gas pressure that had cracked and fractured the AV-coat on the previous mission. Ground testing had extensively validated single-pass re-entry. NASA had data, models, and confidence in how AV-coat behaves when you keep the heating profile steady and continuous. Direct re-entry also meant higher instantaneous heating rates, which sounds scary but is actually well understood. You trade extended moderate heating for brief intense heating, and both approaches work if you have the right material response. The elegance of this solution was that it seemed to address the root cause without requiring a redesign of the heat shield itself. You do not need perfectly consistent AV-coat porosity if you do not subject the material to thermal cycling. You do not need to know exactly how gas vents under pressure if you never allow pressure to build. Change the trajectory, keep the hardware, fly the mission. except there is one detail that makes this solution extraordinary and troubling in equal measure. The direct re-entry trajectory with lunar return velocity had never been flown with a crew aboard before. Artemis I was uncrewed. Every Apollo mission used skip re-entry, not direct. The Saturn V missions that first landed humans on the Moon came back through multiple atmospheric dips, and the astronauts who rode those capsules never experienced the continuous heating profile that Artemis II would experience on direct re-entry. This means that when NASA made the decision to fly Artemis II on a trajectory that had only been tested once in reality, on an uncrewed mission, they were essentially treating the crewed mission as the validation test for a new re-entry profile. The crew became the experimental validation. If direct re-entry created different failure modes than skip re-entry, if the higher continuous heating rates produced erosion patterns, or material fatigue or bondline temperature exceedances that somehow exceeded the AVCOAT's limits in ways that ground testing had not predicted, the crew would be the first and only data source, and that is only assuming they made it home to tell the story. Now, the engineering argument in favour of this decision is sound on its face. Higher continuous heating is stable and predictable. It keeps the material in a steady-state thermochemical environment. It does not create the internal pressure cycles that cracked Artemis I's shield. Ground testing supports it, the thermal models support it, and on the face of the data, the mission succeeded. Artemis II came home. The crew is alive. The mission parameters were met. But here is the question that separates confident engineering from confident engineering that is supported by evidence. Did the heat shield data confirm that the direct re-entry profile worked as expected, or did it reveal new problems that the models missed? Did the fix work because the engineering was sound, or did the fix work because of factors and safety margins that the post-flight data is now sitting on? Because if the direct re-entry profile created its own anomalies, if the char pattern did not match predictions, if material erosion exceeded nominal expectations, if there were localized hotspots or unexpected bondline temperatures, then NASA just learned that switching trajectories solved one problem by creating conditions that might create different problems. And the only way to know whether that actually happened is to look at the heat shield inspection data that nobody is releasing. Part 11. The Man Who Said Don't Fly. In January of 2026, about 3 months before Artemis II launched, a man named Charles Kamada gave an interview that made senior leadership at NASA deeply uncomfortable. Kamada is not some armchair space enthusiast or internet conspiracy theorist. He's a former space shuttle astronaut, mission specialist on STS-114 in 2005. He spent years working inside NASA's Johnson Space Center, rising to become director of engineering, and his expertise is explicitly in thermal structures, heat shields, insulation, the materials that keep astronauts alive during the violent moment of re-entry. He understands the AVCOAT heat shield from the inside. He knows how it is made, how it fails, and what pressures exist inside NASA to approve missions even when the engineering signals caution. In multiple interviews with scientific and mainstream media outlets, Kamada made a straightforward argument. Artemis II should not fly with the same heat shield design that had shown 104 damage sites on Artemis I, and the decision to switch only the re-entry trajectory without fundamentally redesigning or retesting the material was an example of what he called motivated reasoning. He drew explicit parallels to Challenger and Columbia, the 2 space shuttle losses that killed 14 astronauts. In both cases, he argued, engineers had raised concerns that were overruled by institutional pressure to maintain schedule. In both cases, decision-makers had convinced themselves that the risk was acceptable when the evidence suggested otherwise. In both cases, there was institutional commitment to the mission continuing, and that commitment had priority over the data. Kamada was not predicting a specific failure. He was not saying the heat shield would definitely break. He was arguing that the process by which NASA had evaluated the heat shield problem and approved Artemis II was broken. In March of 2026, Kamada published a detailed essay on idle words, a platform frequented by engineers and technologists titled Artemis II is Not Safe to Fly. The piece laid out the engineering argument in granular detail, the material inconsistency in AVCOAT, the limited testing of direct re-entry with lunar return velocities, the absence of independent review, the institutional pressure to maintain the 2026 launch schedule, and the pattern of silences in the data released to the public. Kamada focused heavily on the decision to change only the trajectory and not the material. He asked why NASA was confident that direct re-entry would not create its own failure modes. He questioned whether the ground testing was really sufficient to validate a trajectory that had only flown once before on an uncrewed mission. He pointed out that if you are testing a trajectory for the first time with a crewed vehicle, and if that crewed vehicle is your test subject, then the crew is bearing the risk of the experiment. That is not inherently unacceptable. Astronauts accept risk. But the crew deserves to know that they are in an experiment. They deserve to know that one of the two main variables in their re-entry has been changed because of problems on the previous mission. The response from NASA was formal and carefully worded. Public Affairs released statements saying that all safety criteria had been met, that the heat shield design was sound, that direct re-entry had been validated through modelling and simulation, and that the decision to fly Artemis II had been made by qualified engineers after extensive review. What NASA did not do was release the specific data that would let an independent reviewer like Kamada actually evaluate those claims. No high-resolution images of the heat shield before and after Artemis II. No thermal modelling comparisons. No stress analysis showing why direct re-entry was fundamentally different from skip. No post-flight inspection results. The silence itself became part of the narrative. If the data showed that direct re-entry had worked perfectly, why wouldn't NASA use that data to refute Kamada's concerns? If the heat shield data contradicted his arguments, wouldn't that be the fastest way to put the argument to rest? Instead, there was silence. What makes Kamada's dissent relevant to the unreleased data is not that he predicted a specific failure. It is that he predicted a pattern. Institutional decision-making that prioritizes the mission over the data. The same pattern that preceded Challenger and Columbia. He argued that NASA had learned the wrong lessons from those losses. The agency had learned to create better documentation of the decision-making process, to have more meetings, to have more sign-offs, but it had not learned to question the assumption that the schedule and the mission come first. When a trajectory is changed because of heat shield problems, when the first crewed flight of that new trajectory is your test, when the post-flight data that would validate or invalidate the change is classified or delayed or withheld, you are in the presence of motivated reasoning. You're watching an institution prioritize the narrative of success over the evidence that would confirm or deny that success. Kamada's warning was not, the heat shield will fail. It was, if the heat shield data shows problems, you will not hear about it until it is too late to matter. Part 12. 24 Hours of Silence. From launch to splashdown, NASA operated with remarkable transparency on the Artemis II mission. Daily mission reports were posted to the NASA website. Photographs from the external cameras showed the spacecraft in flight, the Earth below, the Moon ahead. Press conferences were held with flight directors and mission managers who answered questions about trajectory, radiation, system performance, and crew activities. Social media accounts posted updates in real time. When something unusual happened, like the solar flare on Flight Day 8, the public was informed. When the shelter demonstration took place, images and descriptions were released. This was not a secret mission. This was a mission designed to be witnessed, to build public confidence, to demonstrate that NASA could send humans to the Moon and bring them home. Every system was scrutinized, every decision was explained, and the institution was presenting itself as an open book. Within hours of the capsule splashing down in the Pacific on the evening of April 10th, 2026, the book slammed shut. The Navy recovery vessels had plucked Orion from the water, the crew had been safely extracted and placed in quarantine, and the capsule was being carefully secured on the deck of the recovery ship. 2 thermal structures experts and 1 materials engineer were already aboard that vessel, having flown out with the recovery team specifically to begin the post-flight heat shield inspection. These were not junior engineers. These were not people who needed to go back to the lab to start their analysis. They were present at the moment the capsule came out of the water, and they began documenting the heat shield before the sun had fully set on splashdown day. Photographs would have been taken, temperature measurements would have been recorded, the surface would have been visually inspected. The team would have begun the preliminary assessment that would either confirm that direct re-entry worked perfectly or reveal something unexpected. Normally, within hours of splashdown, NASA releases initial observations about the heat shield. The Space Shuttle program had made a routine of it. After Columbia's loss, the agency had made it institutional policy. Heat shield inspection data would be shared with the flight director, with mission control, with the media, and with the independent experts who are supposed to provide oversight. There are official channels for this information. There are news cycles that move fast. There is public interest measured in millions of people around the world who want to know whether the mission was truly safe. But in this case, on April 10th and 11th of 2026, none of that happened. The official NASA channels released updates about crew health, about the successful splashdown, about the engineering team's satisfaction with the mission. But on the specific technical datasets that would answer Charles Kamada's concerns, on the radiation dosimetry results that showed the 18% exceedance, on the heat shield inspection results, on the HERA and DLR sensor data from the M7.5 solar flare. Silence. Not, "We're still analysing the data and we'll release it next week." Not, "Preliminary results look promising, detailed data coming." Just absence. The information hole where the data should be. This procedural anomaly is itself significant. After Artemis I and the 104 heat shield damage sites, after Charles Kamada's very public dissent arguing that NASA was not being transparent enough, after a mission during which the crew was exposed to an M7.5 solar flare in deep space without adequate shielding, the absence of data release is not neutral. It is a choice. It is an institutional decision to withhold information that would normally be shared. NASA knew that the public was paying attention. The agency knew that critics were watching. The agency knew that independent reviewers would want to scrutinize the post-flight data to determine whether the concerns about motivated reasoning were valid or overblown. And yet the data was not released. The photographs of the heat shield remained classified or locked in internal briefings. The radiation dosimetry numbers stayed behind closed doors. The sensor readings from the solar flare were not shared. This is not the action of an institution that is confident in its safety record and its decision-making process. This is the action of an institution that is uncertain, or cautious, or has something to hide. So what are the possible explanations? There are exactly 3, and they form the real story of Artemis II, and only one of them should let you sleep tonight. Part 13. 3 interpretations. When the Artemis II crew splashed down on April 10, 2026, they stepped out of their capsule into a world that had already decided the mission was perfect. The news cycle moved on. NASA released the photos, the measurements, the preliminary assessments. The radiation numbers looked manageable. The heat shield appeared intact. The medical team cleared all 4 astronauts for standard post-flight observation. And already, less than a day later, the technical data that actually matters is sitting in Houston, untouched by public eyes. Why? There are exactly 3 defensible explanations, and each one changes what happens next. The first explanation is the most generous to NASA, and probably the most accurate. Dosimetry analysis is not fast work. When you send biological material to a laboratory, blood samples containing millions of white blood cells, the technicians cannot simply stick them under a microscope and make a call. They must culture the cells, expose them to dyes, photograph the metaphase plates under magnification, count decentric chromosomes one by one, and run statistical analysis on distributions that may span hundreds of cells per astronaut. A single technician can process maybe 40 to 60 cells per day. Multiply that across 10 samples, multiply it across 4 astronauts, and you are looking at weeks of concentrated labour. Heat shield inspection requires similar patience. When engineers need to understand whether a thermal protection system failed in some new and dangerous way, they do not rush. They bring in specialists from the manufacturer. They design a custom scanning protocol. They may take samples. They document every square meter. The HERA sensors and DLR detectors also require calibration verification and cross-checking against redundant systems. All of this takes time. Real time. The kind of time that stretches across a month, sometimes longer. This is not a cover-up narrative. This is how complex scientific analysis actually works. NASA's position, stated through official channels, is straightforward. The data is being processed according to standard protocols, and results will be released when the analysis is complete and peer-reviewed. For many space engineers and biologists, this explanation is entirely sufficient. It squares with everything they know about how institutional science moves, and it may well be correct. But there is a second explanation that sits slightly further toward caution. It is also defensible, and it does not require assuming any malfeasance on NASA's part. This explanation says that the 18% exceedance in the radiation models is real, it is understood, and the data is being carefully contextualized before release. In this scenario, NASA is not hiding the information. NASA is preparing it. There is a difference. The 18% figure, taken in isolation, sounds alarming, but placed within a proper framework, compared to Artemis I predictions, scaled against acceptable career limits, were explained through the physics of why the models were conservative in some directions and aggressive in others, the same 18% becomes a different story. It becomes a correction, a refinement, possibly even evidence that current safety margins are adequate and Artemis III can proceed on schedule with adjusted monitoring but no design changes. This is not a cover-up. It is managing a narrative that could otherwise spin into public panic. NASA would want to explain the 18% on their terms with their experts, in a format that prevents misinterpretation. Release the raw data first, and every news outlet and YouTube channel and Reddit thread will scream that NASA hid a radiation overdose. Release the data with proper context, and the same numbers become a lesson in how good engineering includes margins for error. The agency has every incentive to take the second path, and nothing about that decision violates any regulation or promise of transparency. It just means NASA is choosing when and how to speak, rather than being forced into a reactive stance. The third explanation is the one that keeps this story alive. It says the data has revealed something genuinely anomalous that is still being assessed. It says the 18% exceedance is not fully explained by sensor placement or model conservatism. It says the biological markers may be worse than the electronic data suggests. It says the heat shield may have shown signs of degradation that were not anticipated. It says the HERA sensors or DLR detectors may have recorded a spike during the M7.5 solar flare that contradicts the cruise shelter design. This explanation does not require assuming deliberate deception. It requires assuming that NASA, having found something genuinely unexpected, is now scrambling to understand what it means before making any public statement. This is the least likely of the three, but it is also the most consequential, and it is the explanation that would actually justify the silence. If NASA had simply run routine analysis and everything came back normal, there would be no reason to withhold results. The very fact of the withholding suggests that somewhere, something did not match expectations. Whether that something is merely unexpected or actively dangerous remains unknown. Here is the critical point. All three of these explanations are grounded in reality. None of them requires believing in a grand conspiracy. The first is how bureaucracy actually works. The second is how institutional risk management actually works. The third is how real science actually works when you bump into something you did not anticipate. A reasonable person could align with any of them. Your choice of which explanation you find most plausible says something about your tolerance for institutional delay, your understanding of how organizations protect themselves, and your prior experience with scientific surprises. NASA will eventually release the data, and when it does, we will know which explanation was correct. But until then, the question hanging in the air is not whether the data exists. It is what the data means, and whether it changes the timeline for Artemis III. There is also a fourth layer to consider, and this is where the conspiracy angles enter the room. These are not my conclusions. These are the arguments circulating in aerospace engineering forums, mission operations chat groups, and the spaces where people who know this field inside out are asking uncomfortable questions. One argument claims that if the radiation dose truly exceeded models by 18%, the budget implications alone would be catastrophic. Artemis III is already over budget. Artemis IV is already delayed. Adding a new radiation shielding requirement, or stretching out lunar surface time, or redesigning the mobility unit EVA suits would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and set the entire lunar architecture back by years. NASA's institutional incentive is to frame 18% as acceptable and move forward. This argument has teeth because the funding pressure is real and documented, but it has a critical weakness. The radiation data does not sit in a single channel. The 6 HERA detectors were built by German researchers with access to their own independent analysis. The 4 DLR-M42EXT detectors represent Czech Republic government instruments with separate data custodians. The Mirian dosimeters have their own independent chains of analysis. Multiple nations, multiple independent scientific institutions, all looking at the same event. Suppressing the data across all of these pipelines would require an impossible level of coordination and silence. One email, one leaked data sheet, one researcher deciding that the public has a right to know. That is all it would take, and yet, nothing. Another argument claims that the heat shield may have actually failed in some new way, that the 18% exceedance is a symptom of that failure, and that NASA is assessing whether Artemis III's direct re-entry profile, which has never been tested with a crew, is safe to fly. This argument has appeal because the Artemis I heat shield damage was so extensive and unexpected. But it crashes against a harder reality. Heat shield damage of the magnitude seen on Artemis I would have destroyed the capsule during re-entry. The crew would not have survived. The fact that all 4 astronauts walked away healthy and unburned contradicts the hypothesis that the heat shield failed. A failure that severe would have been visible the moment the capsule was recovered. The engineers would not need days or weeks to determine whether the ship burned up. They would already know. A third argument, more operationally specific, claims that the HERA sensors or DLR detectors may have recorded a clear alarm or spike during the M7.5 solar flare while the crew was sheltering, which would mean the shelter performance was worse than designed. This is operationally logical. This is the kind of data that could change shelter design or crew procedures for Artemis III. And this is the kind of data that would absolutely justify a delay in releasing information, because NASA would want to understand the shelter performance in detail before acknowledging that the shelter may have been less effective than expected. This argument does not require malice. It requires NASA asking an internal question. Should we understand this fully before we say anything? And yes, they probably should. Finally, there is the argument that Charles Kamada was right, that he saw something in the preliminary data or in the institutional patterns that suggested a problem, that he made a principled public stand because his experience with Challenger and Columbia taught him that when you feel pressure to normalize unexpected data, you speak up. This argument draws power from the fact that Kamada is not a fringe voice. He is a former astronaut, a thermal protection systems engineer, and someone with direct experience in how organizational dynamics can lead to catastrophic decisions. The argument does not claim Kamada knows what the unreleased data says. It claims that he knows what institutional silence usually means, and he knows from hard experience that most catastrophic space disasters came from data that was misinterpreted, downplayed, or explained away before the full picture emerged. But here is what cuts through all of these explanations and conspiracy angles alike. The science says the crew is safe. All 4 astronauts are alive. Their blood panels came back normal. Their physical exams revealed no acute radiation injury. They are exercising. They are awake. They are recovering on the timeline expected for deep space astronauts. The question is not whether Artemis II was survivable. It clearly was. The question is whether the sensors that measure how much radiation they absorbed are accurate. The question is whether the models that predict what happens on Artemis III will also be accurate. And the question is whether NASA's institutional decision-making, when facing an 18% model exceedance, will default to caution or default to momentum. Part 14. The blood samples. Inside a secure laboratory at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, there are 10 small vials of blood, 2 vials from each of the 4 Artemis II astronauts, plus 2 control samples. The blood in those vials is currently the most important radiation dosimetry dataset in human history, not because it tells us anything we do not already know about whether the crew survived, not because it contradicts the electronic sensors in any obvious way, but because it offers something that no electronic instrument can offer: biological truth. Blood samples taken immediately after splashdown and at 24 hours post-flight contain living white blood cells that were actually inside the astronauts' bodies when the M7.5 solar flare erupted on April 4th. Those cells absorbed radiation. The radiation damaged their DNA. The damage is still there, written into the chromosomes, waiting to be read. This is where the dicentric chromosome assay enters the picture, and this is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable for anyone who's been reassured by the electronic sensor data. When ionizing radiation passes through a cell nucleus, it does not always break one chromosome cleanly. Sometimes it breaks 2 different chromosomes simultaneously. When the cell's DNA repair machinery kicks in, it sometimes reattaches the broken pieces to the wrong chromosome. The result is a dicentric chromosome, a single chromosome that now contains genetic material from 2 different original chromosomes joined at both ends. A single decentric chromosome is not fatal to the cell. Many cells can survive with decentric damage, but decentric chromosomes are a reliable biological signature of radiation exposure. Technicians count them. The number of dicentric chromosomes per 100 cells, called the dicentric chromosome yield, can be converted into an estimated absorbed dose using well-established biological equations. It is a dosimeter written into living tissue. Here is the critical part. That biological dosimeter does not care whether sensors were mounted on the spacecraft. It does not care whether a HERA detector was positioned at the crew compartment wall or 1 meter away. It does not care about the geometry assumptions built into the electronic model. It reads the total radiation that actually hit the astronauts' bodies. If the dicentric chromosome assay shows higher damage than the electronic sensors predicted, that means the crew absorbed more radiation than the model said they should have. It means the sensor placement did not accurately represent the true radiation environment inside the spacecraft. It means the 18% exceedance might be real, and worse than we thought. The analysis is painstaking. A technician takes the blood samples and cultures the white blood cells in a medium that simulates the conditions inside the human body. After 48 hours, the cells begin to divide. Just before division, the technician adds colchicine, a drug that freezes the cell cycle, trapping the chromosomes in metaphase, the moment when they are most visible and countable. The cells are then treated with dyes that make individual chromosomes stand out under a microscope. The technician photographs the metaphase plate under oil immersion magnification, 1 cell at a time. Then comes the human work. The technician counts the chromosomes, not casually, not algorithmically, visually, by eye, identifying normal chromosomes, identifying abnormal chromosomes, identifying and tallying the dicentric chromosomes. A single technician can process perhaps 40 to 60 complete metaphase plates per working day. To reach statistical significance, you need a minimum of 100 to 200 cells analysed per person. That is roughly 4 to 5 days of continuous work per astronaut. Multiply by 4 astronauts, add in quality control and statistical verification, and you are looking at a month to 6 weeks of focused laboratory work. But here is where the uncertainty enters. Different technicians see different numbers. The dicentric chromosome yield is not an objective measurement like an electronic sensor reading. It depends on technician training, on how strictly you define what counts as a dicentric versus some other abnormality, on the quality of the metaphase plates, on the magnification and lighting used during counting. Typically, multiple technicians analyze the same samples independently, and then the results are compared and averaged. If the preliminary counts suggest something unexpected, if they suggest that the crew received more radiation than the models predicted, then NASA would want to run the samples again. They would want to verify. They would want to bring in specialists from other institutions who could provide independent validation. Because a dicentric count that says the models were wrong by 18% is not something you release to the world without being absolutely certain. This is almost certainly what is happening inside NASA right now. The initial samples are being counted, the preliminary results are coming back, and if those preliminary results suggest higher damage than expected, every instinct in NASA's institutional machinery is pulling toward verification, toward redundancy, toward getting it right before saying anything. This is not evidence of a cover-up. This is how responsible science operates when the stakes are this high. But here is what makes the blood samples truly consequential for Artemis III. Artemis III is not going to be spent inside the Orion capsule. Artemis III is going to involve lunar surface EVAs, extended time outside the spacecraft. Inside Orion, the crew has shielding. The hull, the water walls, the regolith surrounding the habitat module when they are sheltering, all of these attenuate the radiation environment. On the lunar surface outside the vehicle, the crew has only spacesuits. Spacesuits that provide thermal protection, mobility and oxygen, but that are nowhere near as effective as the spacecraft hull at stopping radiation. If the models are 18% wrong inside the shielded crew compartment, they are likely equally wrong outside on the surface, which means the predicted radiation dose for an 8-hour lunar EVA is probably 18% too low. For a crew that is already approaching career radiation limits after just a 2-week mission to the moon, that 18% becomes critical. The other critical element here is international data independence. The Miriam dosimeters are measuring devices that can be analysed only by experienced technicians. But the HERA sensors and DLRM-42EEXT detectors represent continuous monitoring records. They generate data streams. The 6 HERA units, built by German researchers at the Technical University of Darmstadt, have access to their own independent data analysis pipelines. They are not going to ask NASA for permission to analyse their own instruments. They are going to look at their data. They're going to write papers about it. The 4 DLR M42E XT detectors represent Czech Republic government resources. These are not American instruments analysed in American laboratories under American institutional pressure. These are European scientific assets with their own data custodians, their own funding streams, and their own reasons to publish results independent of NASA's timeline. The fact that these international sensors have not released their preliminary analysis is itself notable. Why would a German team, funded by German resources, analysing German instruments, hold back even preliminary findings? Because they are probably comparing notes with NASA. They are probably part of the verification process. They are probably asking the same questions that NASA is asking. Do our results match the preliminary blood analysis? Do our results match the electronic dosimeters? Do we all agree on what actually happened? The silence suggests coordination, and coordination suggests that multiple independent teams are seeing something that requires careful consideration before public release. This is the moment when the mission stops being a triumph and becomes a data point in a longer story about whether the models that guide human spaceflight are actually predicting reality or merely predicting what we hoped would be true. The blood samples will tell that story, and until they do, every plan for Artemis II, every timeline for lunar surface operations, and every calculation about how many EVAs an astronaut can safely fly remains built on an assumption that is no longer certain. Part 15: Artemis III and the Mars Question. The Artemis III mission is currently scheduled to land astronauts on the lunar surface in late 2028 or early 2029. Unlike Artemis II, which flew the crew in lunar orbit and back, Artemis III will involve surface operations. Each surface operation requires extravehicular activity. Each EVA exposes the crew to the radiation environment of the Moon, which is fundamentally different from the radiation environment inside Orion. On the Moon, there is no magnetic field. There are no radiation belts. There is only the solar wind. Occasional solar energetic particle events like the M7.5 flare from April 4th, and the cosmic ray background that penetrates a thin exospheric atmosphere. The only shielding available is the regolith, the lunar soil that the crew will eventually use to build shelters. Until that shelter is ready, until the crew has time to bury themselves in that soil, they are exposed. If the models that predicted Artemis II's radiation environment were wrong by 18%, and if that exceedance applies equally to the unshielded lunar surface, then the predicted dose for a typical Artemis III EVA is 18% too low. This is not a theoretical problem. This is a personnel problem. NASA maintains career radiation limits that vary by age and gender. A female astronaut aged 35 has a career limit of 600 millisieverts. A 55-year-old male has a limit of 1,000 millisieverts. These limits are set to keep the increased cancer risk from occupational radiation exposure below 5% above background. They are federal standards. They are legally binding. The Mars mission, should it ever become reality, would involve a crew on a 900-day round-trip trajectory. The radiation environment inside a spacecraft in interplanetary space, far from any planetary magnetosphere, is approximately 1.2 millisieverts per day for a shielded habitat module. A 900-day mission at 1.2 millisieverts per day produces an accumulated dose of 1,080 millisieverts. That is an exceedance over the career limit for a 55-year-old male. That is a significant exceedance over the limit for a 35-year-old female. If the models are 18% wrong, then nearly every demographic of astronaut becomes career limited for a Mars mission. The math changes, the economics change, the viability changes. For context, astronauts serving on the International Space Station accumulate roughly 0.5 to 1 millisievert per day, depending on solar activity. Artemis II, sheltering in Orion, accumulated roughly 1.2 millisieverts per day. That is 1.2 to 2.4 times the radiation rate of the ISS. And that is inside a spacecraft that was engineered to provide shielding. The ISS astronauts are in a larger vehicle with more mass shielding, and they are still in low Earth orbit where the magnetosphere provides some protection. Artemis II crews were further out in space with less shielding, experiencing a fundamentally hotter radiation environment. If 18% of that difference was not captured in the models, then the entire architecture for lunar return and Mars transit is built on a miscalculation. When the Mars mission launches, it will carry not only scientific instruments and supplies, but also an unsettling awareness that the radiation environment between Earth and Mars is not as well understood as mission planners pretend. The crew will know, because they will have read the reports or been briefed by radiation specialists, that Artemis II discovered radiation levels 18% higher than predicted. They will know that the mechanisms driving that exceedance are not entirely clear, because the complete dataset that would clarify those mechanisms has not been released to independent researchers. They will know that they are travelling to another world in a spacecraft whose shielding was designed based partly on models that failed to accurately predict the cislunar environment. This knowledge is not paralysing, but it is present, and it will shape how they interpret the data they receive about their own radiation exposure. Unlike Artemis II, which was a crewed test mission lasting 10 days, a Mars mission will persist for at least 2 years, with astronauts spending 6 to 9 months in transit to the planet, then months on the surface, and then 6 to 9 months returning to Earth. Over that duration, the accumulated radiation dose will be substantial, and the crew will be acutely aware of that dose because they will carry dosimeters that measure it in real time. These dosimeters will transmit data to the spacecraft's medical systems, where it can be logged, analysed, and displayed to the crew. During Artemis II, the dosimeters showed a dose rate consistent with 18% above predictions. If the same percentage exceedance occurs on the Mars mission, the crew will watch that number accumulate. They will see their own radiation exposure exceed the planned margins. They will know that they are absorbing more radiation than the mission's health and safety models assumed they would. The psychological impact of this knowledge is not adequately reflected in current Mars mission planning documents. Astronauts are trained rigorously and repeatedly to follow procedures, to manage stress, and to maintain focus on mission objectives. They are selected partly for their ability to remain calm under extreme circumstances. But the human brain is not a simple executor of procedures. It is a complex system that processes information, generates expectations, and responds emotionally when reality diverges from those expectations. An astronaut who has been trained to expect that their radiation dose during a Mars mission will remain below certain limits, and who watches through a dosimeter display as that dose exceeds those limits in real time, will experience a mismatch between expectation and reality. That mismatch can generate stress, worry, or a creeping sense of unease. The astronaut cannot stop the process. They cannot accelerate the journey home. They cannot shield themselves any more effectively than the spacecraft already shields them. They can only continue forward, watching the accumulating dose, knowing that they will be absorbing radiation for the remainder of their time in space, unable to escape or mitigate the exposure beyond what is already being done. This is a mission planning variable that has not been formally modelled or studied in the context of Artemis II data, because the complete dataset that would allow such study has not been released. The psychological dimension becomes even more acute when we consider the communication delay between Mars and Earth. An astronaut on the lunar surface during Artemis III can speak with mission control with a 3-second round-trip communication delay. An astronaut on Mars or in transit to Mars will experience a round-trip communication delay ranging from 8 minutes at closest approach to 20 minutes at opposition, depending on the relative positions of Earth and Mars. If a crew member on a Mars mission watches their dosimeter show an anomalous spike in radiation dose, they cannot simply ask mission control what it means. They must wait 10 minutes for their question to reach Earth, and another 10 minutes for the answer to return. During those 20 minutes, they are alone with their measurement, alone with the implications of that measurement, and alone with whatever anxiety that anomaly generates. The radiation specialists on Earth might quickly identify the anomaly as a sensor artifact or a temporary event that poses no additional health risk. But the crew will not know that for 20 minutes. They will have those 20 minutes to contemplate what an elevated radiation dose might mean for their health, for their cognitive function, for their survival during the remainder of the mission. If that anomaly is real and not an artifact, then the conversation becomes more complex. The crew member must now discuss with Earth-based specialists whether the radiation exposure requires any change in mission activities, whether the health risk has increased to a level that demands a change in plans, and whether any mitigation is possible. All of this occurs across a communication channel with a 20-minute delay, and all of this occurs while the astronaut is millions of miles from Earth, with no possibility of rapid evacuation or return. The unreleased Artemis II dataset would provide crucial information for designing psychological support protocols for Mars astronauts, and its absence means that Mars mission planning is proceeding without a complete understanding of how crew psychology will interact with radiation realities that Artemis II has already revealed. The 19-month Mars transit window is opening in 2032. That is how space mission planning actually works. You do not choose when Mars is convenient. Mars chooses. And if Artemis III, the proving ground for human operations beyond Earth orbit, reveals that the radiation models are off by 18%, then every Mars timeline, every Mars architecture, every projection about human settlement beyond Earth is built on a corrected model instead of the model that was current in 2026. That correction might be simple, it might be impossible, but it absolutely requires that the data be understood and released before the next mission launches with human beings aboard. Part 16, The Core Mystery. Let us return to April 4th, 2026, at 0107 hours Coordinated Universal Time. At that moment, the Sun, which had been relatively quiet, suddenly woke up. A magnetic loop in the Sun's active region suddenly underwent catastrophic restructuring. The loop snapped. The energy released was equivalent to about 6,000 megatons of TNT. Scientists call it an M7.5 solar flare. On the surface of the Sun, which is 93 million miles away, the event lasted about 20 minutes. But the light from that flare and the energetic particles accelerated by that flare took 8 minutes to reach Earth's orbit, and right around the time that light arrived, 4 human beings were located directly between the Earth and the Moon, at a distance of roughly 40,000 miles from Earth, nowhere near any protective magnetic field, no radiation belts, no planetary infrastructure. Just a spacecraft, and the spacecraft's name was Integrity. Integrity is an engineering marvel. It is the most advanced human spacecraft ever built. It contains water walls designed to attenuate radiation. It has a crew compartment with additional mass shielding. It has orientation systems that allow the crew to position the spacecraft to minimize radiation exposure during solar events. It was engineered to keep 4 human beings alive in an environment that, historically, we thought would kill them, and it succeeded. Say, the 4 astronauts inside Integrity, when the M7.5 flare arrived, came home alive. They are recovering well. They will live full lives. The mission was successful, but at the moment when the M7.5 flare erupted, Integrity was recording that event with extraordinary precision. 6 Hera silicon detector units were mounted inside and outside the capsule, recording the exact composition, energy, and timing of particles arriving at multiple locations throughout the spacecraft. 4 DLRM-42EXT detectors, built with 6 times the resolution of anything flown before, were capturing the detail of that radiation environment with unprecedented accuracy. 4 Mirion dosimeter badges, worn on the bodies of 4 astronauts, were measuring cumulative dose in real time. 10 instruments, all recording the same event, all generating data, all sending that data back to Houston. The first analysis, based on electronic sensor readings, suggests that the crew absorbed radiation at a rate that was 18% higher than the physical models predicted. The models were built by physicists and engineers who had been studying radiation transport through spacecraft for decades. The models incorporated data from every previous crewed deep space mission, from Apollo to Skylab. They included data from uncrewed spacecraft like the Van Allen probes. The models were, as far as anyone knew, conservative. They assumed worst-case geometry. They assumed worst-case spacecraft orientation. They were supposed to overestimate dose, not underestimate. But they did not overestimate, they underestimated by 18%. That 18% is now locked in a file on a server at Johnson Space Center. The blood samples are being analyzed in Houston. The heat shield is being scanned in a facility in California. The Hera and DLR data are being processed by German and Czech technicians. The international collaboration that created these instruments is running the same numbers, comparing results, asking each other the same questions. Do you see what we see? Does your team agree? The silence that has surrounded these datasets is the sound of scientific verification in progress. The most likely answer is that the data will eventually show that Artemis II was survivable. The crew's exposure was within acceptable limits. The 18% exceedance can be explained by some combination of sensor geometry, modelling assumptions, and our imperfect understanding of how radiation actually behaves inside a complex 3-dimensional spacecraft. The data will be released, the results will be published, and Artemis III will proceed on schedule or with minimal delay because NASA has verified that everything is fine. The second likely answer is that the data will show that the 18% exceedance is real, but it does not change the risk calculus for Artemis III. It means the crew will come home with a slightly higher dose, still within safe limits, still acceptable for mission operations, still sustainable for multiple astronauts across multiple landing sites. The data will be released, the timeline will shift by a few months for additional testing of shelter designs and EVA suit enhancements, and Mars becomes slightly harder, slightly further, slightly more expensive, but still feasible. The third answer, the one that keeps the story alive, is that the blood analysis and heat shield scanning reveal genuine surprises that require significant programmatic changes, that the dichondric chromosome assay shows more damage than the dosimeters predicted, that the heat shield shows degradation that was not anticipated, that the HERA sensors recorded a shelter performance that does not match design specifications. This answer would delay Artemis III. It would require new testing, new analysis, new hardware. It would consume budget and time. But it would also mean that the crew came home, the data revealed a problem, and the system course corrected before sending the next crew into danger. Which of these answers is correct? Only the data can tell us, and the data is sitting in Houston, being analysed by thousands of hours of human labour, being compared against redundant systems, being verified by international teams who have their own professional reputations on the line. The data will eventually emerge, the analysis will eventually finish, the results will eventually be published, and we will know, beyond any doubt, whether the models that guide human spaceflight are accurate, whether the crew absorbed more radiation than expected, and whether the next mission to the moon can proceed on schedule. But until that moment comes, every Artemis III timeline is provisional. Every Mars plan is contingent. Every projection about humanity's future beyond this planet is built on an assumption that was questioned on April 4th, 2026, when 4 human beings in a spacecraft named Integrity found themselves between the Earth and the Moon, directly in the path of a solar flare, and the sensors watching that event started recording numbers that did not match the models. The crew survived. That is the triumph. But the question of what that survival actually cost in biological damage, in thermal stress, in the limits of what we can do and what we should do, that question is still being answered. It is being answered in blood samples and heat shield scans and sensor data streams that will eventually be public. And when they are, we will understand finally what Artemis II really means. The mission is complete. The crew is safe. The data sits in secured servers, being analysed, being verified, being prepared for release. And when that data comes out, when the final numbers are published, when the scientific community has its turn to examine what actually happened in the radiation environment of interplanetary space, that is when the real story of Artemis II can be told. Until then, we wait, we watch, we ask questions, we demand answers. Because the future of human spaceflight does not depend on whether we can celebrate a perfect mission. It depends on whether we can honestly confront the data that mission generated and use that truth to guide what comes next. We went back to the moon. We proved we could survive the journey. We brought 4 astronauts home from the furthest point that any human has travelled in more than 50 years. That is the triumph. But the numbers that tell us what that survival cost, the sensors that recorded what actually happened, the blood samples that carry the biological truth of those 4 bodies' exposure to radiation that was supposed to be predictable but was not, those remain locked in a building in Houston. Until they are released, until they are analysed, until they are published, every Artemis III plan is incomplete. Every Mars timeline is a guess. Every promise about humanity's future beyond Earth, beyond the protective magnetosphere, beyond the radiation belts that have sheltered our species since we first looked up at the stars, that promise is provisional. It is conditional on understanding the data. And the data is waiting. We will be watching. We will be here when the analysis finishes, when the blood samples reveal their secrets, when the heat shield tells its story, when the HERA and DLR sensor data streams are finally open to the world. And we will break it down so it actually makes sense. Because this is not just about 4 astronauts who flew to the moon and came home safe. This is about whether the models that tell us humans can survive beyond this planet are accurate. This is about whether we understand the radiation environment well enough to plan a Mars mission. This is about whether NASA's institutional decision-making will look honestly at unexpected data or will rationalize it away. This is about the future, and the future is waiting for the data to be released.